So I just came off of another session going through WIFM 3.0 for the client enrichment series. And these are actually the slides. And I'm going to kind of blaze through them a bit quickly. Brian, if you ever want to jump in to cover the emissions aspect, I would love to save. The client enrichment series presentation was recorded. At the end of this presentation, there is a link on how to get to it, as well as how to get a copy of the tool, which is WIFM, which stands for Workplace Investment and Feasibility Modeling Tool. What I'm going to be doing is just basically talking about the tool itself, both the original version or the previous version 2.0, which really focused on space, and the latest module edition that the Office of Federal High Performance Green Building, Brian's group, along with Novelis, built and added in for the carbon dioxide equivalents for the emissions. And then what we'll do is we'll also do a quick peek of what the tool looks like, recognizing I am the last session and it is the end of the day, and we'll just go from there. So Workplace Investment and Feasibility Modeling Tool, it's a mouthful. Everyone just calls it WIFM. What it is an Excel, it's just an Excel file with a bunch of logic baked into it, both from space programming aspect and now from the greenhouse gas emission aspect as well. What it's intended to be used for is prior to, let's say, a client, or one of our federal clients, they're going through a space change, and prior to the requirements being developed, and they're kind of thinking about exploring maybe loosening up the telework policy, or maybe doing a bit more as far as working from home, or the reverse, entertaining a potential return to office minimum amount of days. And you want to see what the overall rough order of magnitude impact could be, both from space as well as also addition from emissions. This is a tool for them. It was originally developed in 2018, developed in-house by myself. There was the first version included a cost estimator as well, also for rough order magnitude tenant improvement costs, some technology costs, and some furniture costs as well. That cost estimating part was taken out for a bunch of reasons. I don't want to belabor it here, but just basically say it was better that it was taken out for now, and it's going to be reintroduced in the future. And that was taken out in version 2.02, which was the latest version as of last week or a couple weeks ago. Version 3 adds in those CO2e rough order of magnitude calculations. And it's still intended, as the purpose is the same, is to allow the end user, whether it's our GSA project teams, whether it's client agencies on their own, maybe it's with our consulting partners working with us or our clients, to really see, think about these impacts earlier, and see what potential workplace changes, the positive aspects can come out of, for instance, as far as increasingly adopting hybrid work, for instance. You'll see there is a screenshot of what the tool looks like. We'll make sure to give everyone a copy of the tool. It's one of the nice features. There's two nice features of the tool, where if you've used 2.0 before, this part has stayed the same. Everything related to the space is the same. It hasn't changed. There's also a healthy customization aspect of it as well, where there's different ways to customize the assumptions, whether it be related to individual workspace sizes, such as workstations and offices, allocation ratios as it relates to the distribution of those individual workspaces, as well as allocation of a variety of different support spaces, if you will, like meeting rooms, open meeting tables, those kinds of things. And then there's also a deeper customization feature for those space planners or interior designers or workplace strategists that really want to make this their own. But the other nice things are the customization. It's built for customization. There's no password. It's completely open. Honestly, the password is no password. You just unlock it. It opens up. The other nice thing about this is that once the end user finds a scenario that rings true for them, they're like, okay, this works. It's not causing it passes the smell test, if you will. Then what you can do is use that for the basis of a more detailed requirements development effort. It does show the line by line calculations from which whoever's developing the space program can take that and edit it and refine it for the particulars of that particular project or for that client. And of course, depending on the degree of a change that's envisioned, it's a great way of seeing, because it's Excel and you can easily play with some scenarios as early as you want. If an organization is anticipating a huge change in their overall office area, for instance, it's a good indicator for potential need for either workplace engagement services, such as through the Center for Workplace Strategy, or our regional workplace executives and strategists across the country, or maybe even change management services, depending on the degree of change that's going on there. There are a couple different use cases where WIFM is ideal, but basically it comes down to the earlier the better, where before requirements have developed, any time that an organization is anticipating a change in their telework policy, or they are envisioning a change in their workplace. Let's say, for instance, they need to leave one of our buildings because we have plans for disposition of that building, or whatever the reason. There's no reason why an agency can't use WIFM or the project team to kind of get a sense of what the new workplace could be, particularly on the maths side of things. And of course, those CO2e estimates as well, those rough calculations. This is just reinforcing the point of when WIFM should be used. Earlier is better. For those that are dealing with our client agencies, or if you're planning on using this when you've already done requirements or into design, it's not going to have a lot of utility for you. You're going to find that's a bit clunky, and the assumptions are going to be kind of off. However, if you haven't started those phases yet, then WIFM could be a good tool to use. Now, throughout this entire presentation, as well as the much longer CES session, again, which I'll show you the link to, is if you're using WIFM and you have any questions, or you're like opening it up and it's like, what the heck is Ryan thinking with these allocation ratios? Give me a call, send me an email, we can talk about it. There are things in there such as how meeting rooms, the quantity of meeting rooms are determined, where if you don't agree with Ryan's math, you can put in your own math instead and make it basically work a bit better for you. For client agencies, it's also a great tool where we can customize it. So if, for instance, DHS or labor or another agency that happens to have their own space policy, and they want to make sure WIFM is right for them, we can certainly open that up and change these calculations. The space calculations themselves are essentially really rely on this foundation of what's called the hybrid continuum. It's essentially a way of expressing different levels of hybrid work or telework, as well as the implications when it comes to the space calculations. Which in this instance, the construct we're using is, rather than 5 days a week, we're using 4 hybrid continuum levels. One end of the spectrum, you see there in blue, office-based employees, pretty much in the office all the time, maybe work from home, 1 day a pay period. Definitely need some space. On the end of the spectrum, you have the remote workers, hardly ever in the office. Think of it more of 2 hours, 2 or 3 hours every 2 weeks, popping in, visiting some of their colleagues, and then leaving. They don't need a lot of space, and of course, everything in between as well. Using the hybrid continuum as a starting point, then what ends up happening is the algorithms in WIFM essentially build on top of that, where when it comes to as far as distribution of workstations and offices, they tend to lean more on the higher side, the larger size ones for office-based workers, as opposed to the smaller size for remote workers. Similarly, the mix of meeting and other support spaces changes depending on where the distribution of personnel happens to lie on the hybrid continuum. All of those lookup tables that are in WIFM can be customized. This just represents the default version, if you will, as far as that logic and how the calculations work. To give you an idea, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. We can, if anybody has questions, be happy to do it. This is just meant to give you a sense of the complexity of the tool that's built in, both with respect of taking the hybrid continuum and also taking into account the degree of change that an organization may want to undertake for that particular project, as well as what types of lookup values are used in that particular instance. In this instance, it's for the allocation of individual workspaces. Again, workstations and private offices, or maybe even as far as individual workstation sizes that are used for the detailed calculations to build up that scenario, if you will. And these can all be customized. Everything here can be changed to whatever the project needs or the client or your own personal preferences. Now, when it comes to the carbon dioxide equivalent calculations, there is a module here. I'm going to see if Brian, are you on? I'm doing a call in for a save. You want to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Why don't you talk to us a little bit more about the module here?
Okay, sure. Well, so the carbon dioxide module, as Ryan described, was developed through a kind of not exactly a consensus-based approach, but through a series of expert outreaches that we did with folks across the design and communities that are interested in Scope 3 greenhouse gas reporting. And what we're really trying to do is kind of understand what would be important for us to capture, different ways that people had already looked at this same sort of question, and then test the model that we developed based on that input to see what they thought about it, how we could improve it, et cetera. So it was validated by this cross-sector SME advisory panel. It's a planning and decision-making tool, as Ryan said, not a calculator. It's supposed to be used way early in the design process to give you that kind of rough order of magnitude impression about kind of, if I make this change to the level of telework, what happens to my CO2? It shows CO2 changes based on workplace policies, space requirements, and planning decisions, all the inputs to the WIFM that Ryan just described. And it makes its calculations about how CO2 emissions are going to change, looking at 4 different emission streams. Office building emissions, so if you reduce space or if you increase the amount of space that you need in your office building, what are the building energy emissions that are going to relate or changes to those building emissions that are going to happen? If you increase or decrease telework, how much commuting emissions do change? If you're increasing the amount of time people are working from home, how much do those emissions change? We have a calculation approach that I think is pretty novel for that. And then air travel emissions. And this is very specific to if you have remote workers that you're hiring who are out of the geographic location of your kind of central office, how often do they travel back to that central office to meet with their colleagues? And it calculates kind of an estimate for how much those emissions change. So that's basically what the WIFM carbon module is looking at. To try to address or get our hands around kind of the amount of carbon that's associated with those 4 streams, we really looked to a number of data sources that we could pull information from and continually expect that those data sources would be updated over time, right? So that our data doesn't get stale over the years that we have going forward. And so for building energy use, we looked at the Commercial Building Energy Conservation Study from 2018 that's going to be updated here soon. For the work at home, we draw information from the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. We look at different types of emissions within office buildings using the EIA energy use data. And then we have a novel approach to emissions factors where, if a building is using electricity or natural gas, we have in different parts of the country, we have emissions factors for the generation of electricity that comes from the e-grid. The information that EPA has. The thing that's actually, I think, really interesting about this approach is our smart location calculator, the way we're drawing information about potential changes in commuting emissions. So the smart location calculator was a joint effort between GSA and EPA to look at commuter survey data from the census. And then kind of backtrack it so that we can start to look at, if you work in a certain zip code, where are the likely locations that you're commuting from? What are the average number of vehicle miles traveled per day that you come to that site? And then we can kind of look at that to start looking at, well, if you have so many vehicle miles traveled, what is the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated for kind of an average vehicle for doing that? And then that gives us our projection of kind of what is the carbon implications of, say, increasing the number of days that a person works from home and therefore avoids their commute in that zip code. And we are looking at it specifically for zip codes that are associated with federal buildings. So if you type in the zip code for the federal building that's kind of at the center of your project, it will give you kind of customized vehicle mile travel data for that specific location based on the federal buildings that are in that area. So it's a really kind of unique way of looking at this. The next slide. A couple of assumptions that the WIFM CO2 calculator makes. One is that we're looking at this on an annualized basis. Again, this is a kind of rough order of magnitude calculation that we're making. So we're saying, if you make a change to your commuting pattern, say, or to the amount of office space that you have, and you kept that constant for a year, what would be the change in emissions? In the base case, because I think Ryan showed you there's a comparison of a base case to a couple of different scenarios. In the base case, we're assuming that all employees are office-based and commute 5 days a week. So that's the kind of basis of comparison. And because you're office-based, we don't have any of those air travel or work from home hours in the equation. Air travel, the assumption is that the only thing we're calculating is how often a remote employee is traveling back to the home office to interact with their colleagues. And it's really just the air travel to and from that location, however many times you're assuming they're going to do that in a year. The commuting location or emissions, as I said, is based on that average vehicle mile traveled by zip code. And if you're a fully remote employee, you're considered not to commute at all. Work from home, we're looking at office-based energy calculations based on just the time you would be at work. So we're assuming 240 days, 8-hour work days per year, and we calculate the assumed emissions from your home office during that time. If you're an office-based employee, you don't have any home energy emissions. Next slide, please. So we have 2 case studies that we considered. This is based on GSA occupied space in Chicago and another in Fort Worth. In this case, we were comparing kind of the base case, which was GSA in that space before the pandemic, and then 2 scenarios. The first scenario being what happened actually for that space, post-pandemic, after our kind of return to work and where we ended up with teleworking policy for our employees. And scenario 2 is, what if we'd use the WIFM calculated amount of office space that we should need based on the number of days people are actually coming into the office? And what you can see is that the change between the base case and scenario 1 in Chicago, there's a fair amount of reduction in office space energy use, but the work from home energy kind of offsets that. And it's really, there's a small increase or decrease in overall emissions when you take into account commuting, which is shown in purple as well. Scenario 2 is dramatic, though. You can see that blue color, which is the building office emissions, dropped significantly because we needed a lot less space. You still have the same amount of work at home emissions and the same amount of commuting emissions, which you end up with is a dramatic drop in carbon emissions for Chicago. We did a comparison of what the WIFM said we should get with actual data from looking at each of the employees in this region and trying to understand how many were working from home when they came into the office, how far did they actually have to travel based on where their home office or their home location is and their the office location is. And we actually found that there's some really nice kind of synergy between what the WIFM said and what the actual data for our employees was saying. So change in annual commuting emissions from this HR data, home duty station, and number of days that you're coming into the office, we saw actually a 75% drop pre-post pandemic across GSA and 72% for this location. So 72% to 75% reduction in emissions from commuting. And the WIFM was estimating it should be somewhere around 60%. So it's fairly good for a rough order of magnitude tool. Actual estimated building emissions for GSA occupied space only dropped about 13% from pre-pandemic. And if we are actually in scenario 1 where we maintain most of the space, we didn't give up any space, there was a 25% reduction in building emissions. But if we had followed scenario 2, the emissions would have dropped by 80%. Next slide, please. This is just showing the same thing for Fort Worth. And I think the big kind of takeaway from this case is that you can see the drop in the amount of commuting emissions shown in purple is much more dramatic here. And that's because the commuting emissions in Fort Worth are just higher than the ones in Chicago. So there's a lot more dramatic drop in those emissions from having our employees stay home. In this particular case, there was no change in building space. The region didn't give up any physical office space. So the actual amount of building emissions shown in blue didn't change from the base case to scenario 1. But if we'd followed what the WIFM was recommending for space, it would have dropped considerably. Same sorts of comparisons when you look at the actual employee commuting data against the WIFM. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Brian. What I'm going to do, that was great. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is give you all a quick sneak peek, it does exist. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. Here's what the tool is, through a few Control Z's to bring a few of these values up. And what you see is that as we enter in the information into WIFM 3.0, in this instance, we're going to do a more conservative scenario for scenario 1 with not a lot of workplace change and a distribution, just to make the math easy, 25% across for each of the 4 hybrid continuum categories. It yields this overall distribution as far as space, utilization rate, calculated 2 ways, one with everybody and the other one without the remote workers, and then some emissions calculations as well. You can do a more aggressive scenario and you can see the differences there. And then scrolling down, what we're going to do is we're going to add in for the remote workers. You can also add in for an additional a little bit more nuance as far as to whatever extent, let's say they're traveling. The zip code here is downtown Seattle. So let's say this is a regional office, and of the 25% of personnel, maybe half of them do need to travel to other parts of the region. But let's make their flight frequency, if I can get the cursor to work, let's make it every now and then, so twice a year. And what ends up happening is there's a bit of a lag, is that the values do change as this happens. I'm going to go back to the presentation because I do want to leave it up for some questions. You can find out more about WIFM as well as see the hour and 20-minute presentation of the client enrichment series that happened earlier. I believe the recording is actually going to be ready in a couple days, but give it a week or so, jumping to the very last bullet. Anybody can go to that link and see the recording and really get into more of the details of how WIFM works, some of the questions as it relates to like from the work from home emissions calculations, the assumptions behind that, all that kind of great stuff. For those of you within GSA, you should be able to click this link and get to the share drive where everything's at if I did the settings right. If not, spam me with requests and then I'll get it to you. Of course, there's always sending an email to workplace@gsa.gov. That goes to me as well as a few other of my colleagues, and we can get you a copy. So that's for everyone outside. Internal to GSA, or if you want to tell your clients about other federal agencies, about a more in-depth demonstration of WIFM 3.0, there are some dates and times there. Just go ahead and let them know this is available. They can just email me directly, again, at workplace@gsa.gov. And now we'll get them signed up, and then we'll get into more of the details of how WIFM works. Again, the recording for this morning's session will be available probably in a couple days. You want to be safe, wait until after the 22nd or maybe next week. There are a few other resources here that are available. I'm going to turn it back over to Brian. Sorry, Brian, you should have left yourself off of mute. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the OMB Max and the SF tool?
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. So as Ryan mentioned originally, or early in the presentation, the WIFM is a spreadsheet-based tool. We have also pulled out the carbon estimation portion of the tool without a lot of the kind of ability to make the back-end changes that Ryan has built into the WIFM spreadsheet. But you can take the kind of the current approach that the spreadsheet has, and use OMB Max to do quick visualizations. It's basically a Tableau-based version of the Excel spreadsheet, and it's available to anybody who has a .gov or .mil address to be able to use. So I believe the link is available here for that. Our hope is that in the future, we're going to be able to take a version of the WIFM and actually build it in SF tool so that it would be available to everybody in and out of government to play around with. But that is something that is kind of a future desire of ours. It's not currently available.
Yeah, and I believe these resources are also available on the SF tool, right?
Yes, they are currently. So you can access these through the QR code that's linked there. I'll try to find the direct page that has all three. But these are tip sheets that are used as resources to improve various aspects of the home office. So my personal favorite is the promoting productivity, health, and well-being while working from home. But we also have solid waste management, helping you reduce the amount of waste you generate in home office, and different tips for improving home office energy efficiency. The idea here is really that as we kind of require more and more telework, have more folks that are working remotely, we're kind of shifting the burden and the responsibility for sustainability to the home office, and we should provide some resources to help with that. And that's what these tools are all about. Oh, thanks, Liz, for sharing the link to the
You're
tool.
welcome. Sure thing.
So please do feel free to use these. They're a great tool for the change management process, and they're actually tool 6 in Liz's list of tools that she's been sharing throughout this day.